I want to make sure we get to a question that I know is in the minds of everybody in this room. As I'm sure you know, Canadians feel rather bruised and insulted by Donald Trump. And this has soured many of my countrymen on not just the president, but on our relationship with America. And my impression is that you do not share this assessment of either America or the current occupant of the White House. Don't want to put words in your mouth. What would you say to Canadians, first, to convince them that America is still the indispensable nation, if you agree with that? Or is it in terminal decline? And does it still retain its traditional capacity to reinvent itself, which is the thing I most admire about American society, its infinite ability to renew itself? And second, what would you say to Canadians that might get them to think afresh about Donald Trump? Is he a consequential president? Or someone we'll all be relieved to see in the rearview mirror? Or maybe both?
Well, this is one of these great opportunities that come my way occasionally, how to lose an audience completely.
I wanted to give it to you early on.
Say something positive about Donald Trump in Canada. And it's a suicide mission. Look, I think there's a great deal of nonsense written about President Trump. And this has been true for 10 years now, because he burst onto the scene. It's more than 10 years now since he announced he was going to run for president. And when people had stopped mocking him and began to realize that this was a serious proposition, a series of wild analogies began to be published regularly in the US liberal media, as well as in Europe and in Canada. And the analogies were with Hitler, with Mussolini, or with Roman emperors, you know, the Julius Caesar, Augustus analogies. And I have spent a decade saying how absurd these analogies are and unnecessary. They're superfluous. They're category errors. It's a category error to draw a comparison between the United States in our time and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. It's just a fundamental misreading of history. Donald Trump is a very United States figure. He comes out of an American tradition. You can see the influences from the 19th century and the 1970s in Trump. The way I try to explain this to skeptical British and European audiences is he's like a combination of Andrew Jackson, William McKinley, P.T. Barnum, and Richard Nixon. If you imagine all of those distinctly American figures combined into one person, you have Donald Trump. So the first thing to understand is he's quintessentially a product of the American populist tradition, and he's only puzzling if you don't know any 19th century American history. If you don't know any 19th century US history, good luck. But if you know some, you'll know that tariffs were central to American politics in the 19th century. You'll know that the debates on immigration produced restrictive acts beginning in 1882 to limit immigration into the United States. You will know that cheap money and skepticism about central banks was rooted in that populist tradition. You'll see how very, very American he is. And we don't need to invoke fascists or Roman emperors to understand him. It's just superfluous. The next thing you have to understand is that you couldn't go on the way the United States was going on in the period from around 2000. It was unsustainable in at least two ways. Number one, the decision to admit China into the World Trade Organization and allow China to hollow out North American manufacturing by not holding China to its World Trade Organization commitments was a disaster for every American except the 0.1% who massively profited from what I call Chimerica. The median household saw its income in the United States stagnate. It did not move from 1999 until 2016, flatlined. That wasn't sustainable. Nor was it sustainable for the United States to deploy armies to places as far afield and intractable as Iraq and Afghanistan for what seemed like indefinite periods of time. These two things, globalization and the neoconservative vision of foreign policy, were broken and no longer economically or politically viable by the year 2016. The only surprising thing to me when I moved to the United States, which was way back in 2002, was the lack of protectionist candidates in American politics. I kept asking my colleagues at NYU and then at Harvard, where are the protectionists? It's like, this is like a no-brainer. There were none, because the Republicans and Democrats had decided that Chimerica was win-win. Except the only people who weren't winning were American voters. It took Donald Trump to challenge the consensus on China and globalization, to challenge the consensus on immigration, which was essentially let them all come, to challenge the consensus on foreign policy. So if you think there was some way of stopping Donald Trump, you have to really work hard to explain to me why he got elected twice, and why the second time he got elected by a bigger margin than the first time. Because Americans, they decided maybe we made a mistake, so let's try to see if the Democrats have got anything. We'll give them another chance. So they did, and we had the Biden-Harris autopen presidency, which proceeded to fail in every respect. Economically, inflation hit 9%. On migration, they had an open borders policy. 2.3 million people a year entered the United States, mostly illegally, on Joe Biden's watch. And foreign policy was like a sort of sequence of failures of deterrence of extraordinary incompetence. Afghanistan, then the failure to deter Putin, then the failure to deter Iran that produced October 7th. And so American voters, not unreasonably, given the choice between more of that with Kamala Harris or a second Trump term, voted for Trump. So this is not so surprising. Did Canada feature in American thinking in any of this? No. No. Nobody thought about Canada anymore.
You shock me.
I know, I'm the bearer of bad news, but nor did anybody in England give a damn about what the Scots thought in 2016 when they voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. Scots didn't. Scots voted to stay in the EU. But you matter as much to Americans as we Scots matter to the English, which is not much. Not much. So the only moment when Canada mattered, really in the last 10 years, was when Justin Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago to see Donald Trump, and Trump trolled him at dinner. Why did you could be the governor? Let me do this to you. You could be the governor. My tie's not quite long enough.
And your socks are the wrong color.
You could be the governor of the 51st state, Justin. How about that? And Trudeau is like completely falls right into the trap. Everybody's laughing because it's obviously a joke, but he kind of falls into the trap, and then you all fall into the trap. And Trump, who has an unerring instinct for human weakness, it's like his superpower is he can tell the weakness of the counterpart. It's like, I have got them, so I'm just going to pile on. I'm going to make this 51st state thing seem like I mean it. And you take the bait. And then, of course, because he's Trump, he doesn't think about the second-order consequences of what he's doing. Because I don't think anybody in Mar-a-Lago is like thinking, this could have an effect on the Canadian election. Has anybody run this past Pierre Poilievre? No, nobody had run it past anybody. The whole thing was completely impromptu. And you end up with Mark Carney as Prime Minister, because the only law of history is the law of unintended consequences. That is what happened. Americans got what they wanted, which was to end all the pathologies that I described to you, and you ended up with Mark Carney as Prime Minister. Funny world, isn't it?